Images are powerful in a range of different ways, but I think one of them has to do with the way in which images convey the meaning of political events across distance to audiences far away. They give us a sense of the real, so to speak, a sense that we might be able to be there, see what's happening. It's impossible to imagine the nature of 9/11 and the impact of the 9/11 without images. They circulated immediately, they gave audiences worldwide an idea of how traumatic the event was, how terrible it was, and it was in fact designed for visual impact. So images, once they become iconic, they often come to stand for the events themselves. We all know iconic images of the Vietnam War. We know iconic images of the Tiananmen massacre, of the lone protesters standing in front of a series of tanks. We know the iconic image behind us. So these kind of images are in our collective consciousness. Be aware of them. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk at Brisbane Girls Grammar School. I talked to 12-year-old girls. I showed them images of the Vietnam War, images of Tiananmen. They all knew these images, and the events happened 20 years or 30 years before they're born. But this is part of our collective consciousness. Now, images aren't new. Images have been around from the beginning of time, but there's two ways in which images have changed, or the politics of images have changed in recent years. The first one is the speed at which images circulate. Even during the time of the Vietnam War, it would have taken quite a few days, if not weeks, for a photograph to make the front page of the New York Times, for instance. Today, if an image is picked up, it'll circulate immediately worldwide. So the speed of circulation of images is dramatic and has an incredible political impact. The second way in which images are different today is it used to be that very few people, global media networks, had access to images and the power to circulate them. Today, everyone can take an image on a smartphone, upload it on social media, and circulate it. So there's a certain democratization, if you want, of the visual field. And these evolutions go to the point where some people argue that we actually live in a visual age. Tom Mitchell, a political theorist, talks of the pictorial turn, because the world around us, the political world around us, is so much shaped by a range of images, still moving ones. First of all, it's just important to recognize that often images, particularly of political crisis, are inherently emotional. Again, 9/11, you can't get more emotional in terms of seeing people dying, suffering at a massive scale, images of humanitarian crisis. They're all in content emotional. They're emotional in terms of how people react in a range of ways. And it's interesting to see how images have this particularly emotional impact. You will often see on television, in the internet, warnings that when terrible images follow of suffering, of death, that viewers might be distressed and should be warned before seeing these images. We never get these warnings before words. We never hear warning. Some people might be distressed by the words that follow, even though words describe terrible things just as much. But there's something about images that has us react in a very, very sort of visceral, emotional manner. There's instances when photographs, or as well moving images, can have a very direct political impact. They can promote social change, they can generate political and social sort of upheavals, if you want, and alterations. I'll give you just two examples. One of them is from last year's refugee crisis in Europe, where we saw an image of a 3-year-old refugee, Alan Kurdi, from Iraq, from Syria, dead on the beach in Turkey. That image circulated immediately across the world, and it had people kind of respond with a level of empathy, of generosity that was quite unusual. All of a sudden, across Europe, and particularly in Germany, we had the emergence of what was called a Willkommenskultur, a culture that welcomed refugee. And this one image of a 3-year-old dead boy played a huge role in that. Of course, we all kind of empathize with a 3-year-old boy. We all were children once, children are innocent, and to see an innocent victim is something that really, really rallied people around that. To the point even that there was not just changes in public attitude, but the German government, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, adopted a much more progressive policy towards refugees, much to the dismay of her own Conservative Party. And this one image can really be seen as having triggered a tremendous political change in a short period. There's been a backlash since, but still this one image had a really tremendous political impact. The second example are images of torture at Abu Ghraib, at the American prison in Iraq. The interesting thing here is that well before these images emerged, there was pretty much awareness that torture was going on in the context of America's rendition program. There was a prominent article in the New Yorker that outlined the use of torture. No one cared. There was no public discussion, there were no policy debates. But as soon as images emerged from Abu Ghraib showing American soldiers torturing Iraqi prisoners, there was a massive public outcry, massive public discussions on whether or not torture should be a legitimate way of waging the war on terror. Policy changes. And again, it was not about the knowledge of torture, it was about the image of torture and the way in which people witnessing the horror of torture, the demeaning nature of torture through images that tremended this political change. It doesn't happen very often that images cause political and social change directly, but often they do so indirectly. They do so through what the French philosopher Jacques Rancière called the distribution of the sensible. That is to say, images delineate what we see and what we don't, what we feel and what we don't, what we rationalize and what we don't, what is politically feasible and what we don't. And these boundaries shift when images shift. For instance, when we all of a sudden see images of torture, we have the ability to open up debates on torture. But often, in that sense, images work more slowly over time and change how we approach things politically, how we conceptualize things politically, and what is and is not feasible in the realm of politics and social change.